The school bell in the old high school rung like it does every night at 12, but nobody knows who rings it. Nobody knows why either. Some say that the bells are rung to call all of the spirits to the school, but that might just be part of an urban legend. I don't know why the bell rings, but I do know who or what it is that's ringing it. But to be honest, I wish I didn't know. I wish I was just like everybody else who is left to wonder every night at 12, who is ringing that damn bell. The school was shut down in 1992 after a series of mysterious deaths took place inside the school. Some people in the town believed that it was haunted by the spirits of the teens who were killed in the school back in 1972. Some say they heard whispers as they walked by, and some say they've seen people staring at them through the windows. Nobody was ever brave enough to spend over an hour in the school. The longest anybody had ever spent was 45 minutes, and that was during the daylight, but myself and my partner, Charlie, had agreed to spend an entire night in the school for our web show Ghost Seekers. We came all the way from Australia and arrived at the school at 11:30, just before midnight. We gathered all of our equipment, flashlights, cameras and everything else we used for our ghost seeking. We entered the building, kicking the pile of empty bottles and soda cans on the way. I was up for the challenge, but deep down inside, I was secretly afraid, and I know that Charlie was as well. I wish we knew what we were getting into. "Hello!" Charlie yelled, his voice echoing through the school. We had our cameras on record and our flashlights in our right hands as we walked through the halls of the abandoned school. Everything was calm for the first 15 minutes until we heard the sound of a locker closing. The sound echoed throughout the building. Every sound pretty much had an echo to it. We decided to follow the sound down the hall where the old gym was. According to our research, 8 students were killed in the gym, and we thought that would be a good place to start. When we entered the gym, we could immediately feel that something was in there. We didn't need our EMF to be sure. The air was cold and the sound from our walkie-talkies were nothing but static. Something was interfering with the signal. We at least had some light from the moon that shined through the large windows, so it wasn't completely dark. As we were walking through the gym, the bell in the bell tower went off. It must have been midnight. I saw the bell tower through the gym windows, and at the time, I thought maybe I was imagining things because I saw someone up there. It was a silhouette of what appeared to be a man. I shook it off and continued what I was doing. Despite the obvious fact of a presence, we weren't getting much activity in the gym. No whispers, no footsteps, nothing. It wasn't until we were heading out that something happened. A basketball suddenly came rolling towards us from the back of the room, an area where the light wasn't shining. It was an old dusty ball, and I admit that it had me feeling really uneasy about the situation. I was a veteran at ghost hunting, but I had never experienced something like that. It wasn't much though, compared to what happened next. We were walking through the halls of the second floor when I noticed something weird about one of the rooms. I looked through the rectangular glass and I noticed a TV was on. It was strange because there was no power in the school. As I continued looking, I was startled by a sudden darkness that covered my view. It was just completely dark, as if someone or something were blocking it off. "Hey mate," I said to Charlie. "There's someone in there." "No way there is," Charlie said before looking through the glass himself. We were both shocked, and the reason for that was because we never actually saw a spirit before. All we ever saw were dark shadows in the footage we caught. But this wasn't a shadow, this was something more sinister. According to our research, this was the room where the killer shot himself. He was dressed in all black. When I looked back inside the room, the TV was off and whoever was standing in front of the door was gone. It was standing there for over a minute, and I was honestly ready to make a run for the door, but Charlie kept me from doing so. I wish he hadn't. We continued walking through the halls. By this time, we were hearing all kinds of noises echoing throughout the school. We heard footsteps, lockers opening and closing, and we heard loud crash noises that sounded as if something was being thrown. It seemed like the more we stayed in there, the weirder things would get. Charlie thought that if we split up, we'd be able to get more footage faster. The more footage we get, the less time we'll spend in here, he claimed. Though I agreed with him, I didn't think it was worth it. Nonetheless, I found myself wandering the halls alone. "See anything weird yet, mate?" Charlie asked through his walkie-talkie. Thankfully, I wasn't hearing or seeing anything strange. I kept walking down the halls. My flashlight suddenly started flickering. The batteries were just put in there was no way it could have been dying, but it did, and I found myself alone in the dark. Or maybe I wasn't alone. "My bloody flashlight died," I said into my walkie. No reply. "Charlie? Are you there?" Static. Nothing but static. I could hear someone trying to say something. "He's behind you," whispers from the walkie. I turned around, but I didn't see or hear anything. I stood there in the dark, amazed I had yet to piss my pants. A minute or two later, I heard a scream that echoed through the halls. It was Charlie. I didn't know what to do. I screamed his name. I called to him over the walkie-talkie but got no answer. I froze in fear and I didn't move until I heard a voice echoing through the halls. It sounded as if they were far away, like on the other side of the school. "Steve. Where are you?" "I'm over here," I yell. "I can't see shit, mate." I start walking and then suddenly I was grabbed and pulled into the corner. I was screaming, tried to fight him off until I realized it was Charlie. "Don't do that, mate," I yelled. "I heard you calling me, why didn't you answer back?" He had a strange look on his face. I could see in his eyes how terrified he was. "That wasn't me, mate," he said. "I never called you." We decided that the fame, ratings or any of that stuff was no longer worth it. We replaced the batteries in our flashlights and walked back to the front entrance. We reached the entrance minutes later, but for some reason, the door was locked. We kicked it, punched it, rammed it with our shoulders, but it would not open. We were trapped and we realized there was probably no way out. Somebody or something didn't want us to leave. So we decided to stay put. We had our backs against the door and we didn't move. I was greatly regretting ever stepping foot in that damn school, and I'm sure Charlie was as well. I woke up about 30 minutes later. I must have dozed off. I looked around. Charlie wasn't anywhere in sight. "Charlie," I whispered into my walkie. "Where the bloody hell are you?" No answer. Just static. I stood up on my feet and I noticed someone at the end of the hall. They were just standing there, about 50 feet away. "Charlie. Is that you, mate?" I started to walk slowly toward whomever it was. I heard my pulse beating, echoing through the halls. My breath, swiftly moving in and out of my mouth. My footsteps, faintly touching the floor. As I got closer, I realized it was not Charlie at all. I stood still but I could still hear my pulse beating, my breath still moving swiftly in and out. He was just staring at me. He was probably staring at me the whole time I was asleep, the whole time I was slowly walking toward him. He was in some black janitor suit and his face was pale with multiple stitches all over. His eyes were dark, I saw the evil within. His head was tilted sideways as he continued to stare. I didn't understand what it was I was looking at. I've never seen a spirit so real before, but he wasn't just a spirit. He was a demon. "Run!" Something from my walkie yelled, and it most certainly wasn't Charlie. I ran. I didn't know where I was running to, I just ran and I didn't look back. I ran into a classroom on the other side of the school and I locked the door, knowing that if whatever it was a spirit, a locked door wouldn't stop it, but it made sense at the time. I stayed in there for about 10 minutes. It was dark and I didn't know whether or not someone else was in the room with me. "Steve. Steve, it's me." It was coming from my walkie. "Where the bloody hell are you, Charlie?" "I don't know. I woke up in some room." "What room? Where are you, mate?" I could hear him weeping through the walkie. "Steve. I'm scared," he cried. I started tearing up myself. I never heard him cry like that before. I'd known him since we were 14 and I'd never heard that. "It'll be okay, Charlie, we'll be okay," I cried, hoping I was right. He was weeping uncontrollably. I knew that something was wrong. "You don't understand, mate," he cried. "Look to the right corner of the room." I lifted my flashlight. I didn't understand what the hell was going on. I pointed to the corner and I literally froze in fear. I dropped the walkie to the floor. I couldn't breathe. I cooled T. He was dead. Charlie was dead. I'm sorry, mate. That was the last time I ever spoke to him. I didn't understand how he died. There was no blood, no cuts or anything. I guess he saw something that literally took his breath away. I didn't even think about how I was talking to him over my walkie even though he was clearly dead. The only thing I thought about was that my best friend of 20 years was gone and I didn't know what to do next. I thought about it and I realized it must have happened when we split up. His scream, I kept thinking about his scream. I lay there with his body and I woke up hours later to the sun shining upon my face. I'd never been so happy to see the sun. I figured it was over. I pulled out my phone and I was finally able to call the police. They arrived, and I was finally free of that school and whatever haunts it. I drove away, never looking back. That school needs to be burned down and hopefully it can kill the demon that lives within it. I can't go anywhere anymore without feeling like I'm being watched. I was traumatized and I still am. I saw what can never be unseen and no matter how many hours of therapy I go through, I'll never be the same person I was before. I wonder if anyone ever seen Charlie through the windows, or even heard his whispers as they walk by. If they had, I hope they weren't scared because Charlie was a great guy. If you ever see him, tell him Steve said hi and that he misses him dearly. I don't think I will ever forget what happened in that school. I would never forget the sound of that bell and I would never forget the demonic face of the thing that rings it. I could see him now, standing up on that bell tower, waiting for midnight and waiting for his next victim. Credit to Clyde Jacobs Tim. Credit to Clyde Jacobs Tim. I don't like telling this story and most people don't believe it when I do. It brings back too many painful memories that I've been running away from since I was a 10-year-old boy. I'd been called a devil, a murderer, a child just desperate for attention. I'm 40 now and I'm sure people still question my sanity. I even question my sanity. It's been 30 years, but I will never forget what happened in that house. I will never forget what I heard, what I saw. I saw things and heard things that no living person should see. Things that would leave a scar that can never heal and things that would leave you questioning your sanity. I'll warn you, this true story is not for the faint of heart. It was in Ohio, 1985, when we moved into the house. My mother was looking for a fresh start after my father's abusive acts became too much for her to bear. He never touched me or my sister, Hannah, in any harmful way, but he and my mother would go at it almost every night. My mother would be left with a black eye and a swollen lip. I pretended like I didn't know what was going on. I regret that now. When we first arrived at the house, I could tell that it was really old. The windows were dusty, the paint was weathered and peeling off, and the grass stood almost as tall as I did. It looked abandoned, as if we were the first people to live there in decades. There was also an old swing set in the back and behind that was a pond that held dirty water with a greenish color. The fence would creak as you open it, as did the stairs. The first 2 months were silent, nothing was really out of the ordinary, but I noticed something that seemed strange to me. I was in the house looking through the window to make sure that Hannah was okay being alone in the backyard. She was on the swing set, but, oddly the swing next to her was moving back and forth, as if someone was there with her. But there was no one there, nobody but Hannah. I figured it was probably the wind. I went out there, because I didn't want her out there alone. I was very protective of my sister. When I sent her inside, I stayed out there for about a minute and I thought maybe I was imagining things because I saw someone in the hallway window. They looked down right at me, I couldn't really see their face. Maybe it was Hannah. Maybe it wasn't. It wasn't really until the next night when things got frightening. Hannah's screaming echoed through the house in the middle of the night. My mother and I woke up and quickly ran to her. It sounded as if someone were attacking her, but we didn't see anyone. She was just screaming on the top of her lungs, pointing up at the ceiling. She's trying to drown me. She screamed more than once. We didn't see anything, but she saw something that night. Something was there. After that night, things started getting weird. I've heard footsteps echoing through the house, and I know this is going to sound weird, but I've heard someone singing. It sounded like a young girl, and I know it wasn't Hannah because it sounded nothing like her. I was laying in my bed when I heard it. It must have been around midnight because everyone else was asleep. She sung it over and over again. The birds are singing, singing, singing. Go to bed, go to bed. I'll see you in the morning, morning, morning. Now rest your head, rest your head. It got louder and louder. It sounded as if they were coming toward me. They were getting closer and closer until eventually, they were right at my door. I heard water dripping. It sounds strange, but I know what I heard. The singing stopped suddenly and all I could hear was the water dripping. Then everything became silent. The doorknob started turning just slightly. I hid under my covers and eventually whoever it was or whatever it was had left. That wasn't the only time I had a weird experience like that late at night. I've also heard whispers. Most of the time I heard them coming from the basement. I never understood what the whisperer was saying, but one night I heard them loud and clear. I was asleep. I heard footsteps in my room. It felt like someone was watching me, like someone was sitting right at the edge of my bed. I lay there with my eyes closed, hoping it'd go away. Then it whispered, "Who are you?" I didn't reply. I didn't want to make a habit out of talking to things I couldn't see. It sounded like a woman. I guess it left afterwards because I didn't hear anything else. I was horrified by what was going on in the house. I tried to explain it to my mother, but she never believed me. She claimed I was dreaming, and I almost believed that maybe I was dreaming. My mother seemed distant. She wasn't the same person anymore. I was worried about Hannah as well. She must have been traumatized by what she saw that night. I loved my sister, we did a lot together, but she became distant as well. One day as I walked past her room, I heard her singing. The birds are singing, singing, singing. Go to bed, go to bed. I'll see you in the morning, morning, morning. Now rest your head, rest your head. I walked in her room, and she stopped singing. She was sitting on the floor, drawing as usual. Where did you learn that song from, Hannah? I asked her. I learned it from my friend, she replied, pointing towards the corner of the room. I looked around the room, but I didn't see anyone or anything. I noticed her drawing and it was really strange. She drew herself sitting on the swing and next to her was another girl. Who is that girl you drew? I asked her. That's my friend, her name is Maddie. I figured she had an imaginary friend. She was 6 years old, so that was normal, but that didn't explain the song. Is she the one who taught you the song? She shook her head yes. Her mother used to sing it to her every night, she told me. And she still does sometimes. Well, where is she now? I asked her. She dropped her crayon and stood up off the floor. She's behind you. It was then that I felt a cool breeze rush through my body. I turned around slowly just to see myself through the mirror that hung against the wall. That's when I saw her. She was only there for less than 2 seconds, standing to the right of me and drenched in water. She looked young, around 6, the same age as Hannah. I wasn't as scared as I should have been. I asked Hannah if she was the girl who was on the ceiling that one night. She said no, and that the one who was on the ceiling was Maddie's mother. She said that her mother was evil and that she would kill us if we told anybody about her. The same way she killed Maddie. I wasn't scared until then. I wanted to tell my mother, but I'm sure she wouldn't have believed me anyway. I just wanted to protect my sister, so I said no word about it to anyone. I didn't really think that a ghost could do any physical harm, but I was 10 at the time. I didn't know much about ghosts. The only thing I knew about them was that they were people who were once living. Later that day, I was walking past the basement when I heard the laughter of a young girl. It sounded like Hannah, so I walked down the stairs. She was sitting alone in the middle of the basement. You shouldn't be down here by yourself, Hannah, I said to her. I'm not by myself. she said. She had one of those old jewelry boxes with the ballerina that would twirl and play music when you open it. "What are you doing down here?" I asked her. Maddie wanted to show me her jewelry box. I looked around. I didn't see anybody, not that I wanted to. I felt very uneasy, like somebody was watching me. Somebody was there. "We have to go now," I yelled. "We need to get upstairs." I just didn't want to be down that basement. "Shh, she whispered. "You're gonna wake her mother." "Get up, Hannah," I yelled. I heard a noise. It came from the other room of the basement. Hannah started crying. I could see the fear in her eyes. She stood up on her feet, dropping the jewelry box. "Danny," she cried, pointing behind me. "She's behind you." My heart popped out of my chest. I remember shaking and my heart beating at a rapid pace as I slowly turned around. I froze in fear for a few seconds. She was there. She had long black hair and was wearing a black gown. Her face was pale and her eyes were pitch black. It was like looking in the eyes of death itself. I grabbed Hannah and we ran upstairs to our mother. I wasn't sure if she believed us. She told us to stay out of the basement and that was it. The face still haunts me to this day. The birds are singing. Hours after that frightening experience, I lay awake in my bed as I couldn't sleep. It was past midnight, so everyone else was asleep. I heard music coming from outside my room. I got out of bed, thinking that maybe it was Hannah. I peeked out my door, but I didn't see anyone. I walked down the hallway and on the floor, in front of Hannah's room was the jewelry box from the basement. I watched as the ballerina twirled around and around and around. Everything was like in slow motion. I became lightheaded. The air was cold and heavy. Somebody was watching me. I heard somebody singing that same song. It was a young girl this time. It was a woman. The singing was coming from Hannah's room. I opened her door, the singing stopped and I didn't see anyone. Hannah was fast asleep. I asked her about it the next day, but she had absolutely no idea what I was talking about. Weeks after that incident was when everything took a turn for the worse. Just like before, she was screaming on the top of her lungs in the middle of the night. We ran to her, my mother and I. "She's trying to drown me," she screamed. "She's trying to drown me." "Who?" my mother asked. "Who are you talking about?" Hannah stopped screaming and stood from her bed. She was shaking, her face was pale and her voice became weak. Her eyes were wide as she stood there, almost like she was frozen, like she couldn't move. "She's behind the door," she whispered suddenly, pointing at the door with a horrifying look in her eyes. Bam! The door slammed shut and I found myself alone, outside in the hallway. They were screaming. My mother and my sister were screaming and there was nothing I could do. I tried to open the door, but it was stuck. "Let me in! Let me in!" I yelled. I kicked and I punched because that was all that I could do. They were screaming as loud as they could until suddenly the screaming stopped. "Mom! Hannah!" I screamed out. No answer. They were dead. My mother and sister were dead. That was all I could think. The birds are singing. Go to bed, go to bed. I'll see you in the morning. Now rest your head, rest your head. It sounded like my mother. I heard the door unlock from the other side. I opened it slowly to find my mother sitting at the side of the bed, singing to Hannah who was fast asleep. She then stood up. I saw the emptiness in her eyes as she walked by me, as if I weren't even there. I was beyond confused. It just didn't make any sense. I woke up the next morning to a loud noise coming from the kitchen. I ran downstairs to see my mother making breakfast, soaking wet and singing that damn song. "Why are you wet, Mother?" I asked. She said nothing. "Where's Hannah?" "Who are you?" she whispered. "It's me, Mother. I'm your son." She looked at me, staring into my eyes as if she were stealing my soul. She smiled, a crooked evil smile I never saw before. "I don't have a son," she said. "Now run along, Maddie isn't available." She walked down the basement and closed the door. After less than a minute, I heard a loud noise that echoed from the basement. I ran upstairs to Hannah's room, searching everywhere for her. She wasn't in there. I walked out into the hall and that's when I saw her walk down the stairs. I breathed a sigh of relief. I thought she was dead. I chased after her, she led me outside, but I lost her as I shuffled through the tall grass. I ran to the backyard, thinking she might be playing on the swing set. I didn't see her, but the swings were both swinging rapidly. I heard laughter. It sounded like two young girls, one of them actually sounded like Hannah but I couldn't see anyone. I walked behind the swing set and that's when I saw her. She was floating lifeless, face down in the pond. I heard her voice as it echoed with the wind. She was singing. The birds are singing, singing, singing. Go to bed, go to bed. I'll see you in the morning, morning, morning. Now rest your head, rest your head. Now rest your head, rest your head. Now, I moved to London in 2011. The reason for my move to London is very simple, but holds a legend so shocking that I'm not even sure of its truth, only its impact. Up until 3 years ago, I lived in the town of Wickford, Essex. For those of you who are not well versed in the geography of southeast England, Wickford is, by definition, a shithole. Made up of a high street with nothing bigger than a small W.H. Smith's, a cooperative, and a 99p store. It is a boring and scuzzy place, an urban cesspit. I didn't leave because of these factors. Running through Wickford is the River Crouch. Whilst parts of the Crouch in Wickford are slightly nice looking, the town centre's section of the Crouch is banked by concrete, a provision put into place following 2 floods back in the late 1950s. The result of this is a complex, and very ugly, tunnel system, interlocking with the sewers. Now that I have provided sufficient context for the, perhaps true, myth, I will begin. In 1979, a pupil at a local secondary school, the name of which I genuinely don't know, adding to the idea that this legend is make-believe, was feared. His name was Jack Caden, and whilst a popular womanizer, his mean streak bordered on sadism. He relished in putting his other peers in pain, so much so that he made your average playground bully seem generous. Caden's good looks were unmatched, even though his grin was apparently wolf-like and deeply unsettling. On a fateful, stormy night in the middle of winter 1979, a group of the more commonly targeted of Caden's antics felt that they had finally taken enough grief from him. They attacked him as he strolled down London Road. The group of 6 boys and 2 girls bagged him. They lugged the powerless Caden to underneath the London Road Bridge, and to the partially concealed concrete Crouch Bank. I'm not totally sure what those 8 people precisely did to Caden, but I do know that his face was mutilated to the point that he was unrecognizable. They then left him for dead. His body, however, was never found, and the police ceased their search for him 3 years later. In 1986, one of the girls was found naked at the same place that Caden had been mutilated. Her neck had been snapped, and her entrails were littered on the concrete of the bank. Pinned to her forehead was a note. Cold. The police struggled to find a motive. The unmarried girl had just given birth to a daughter, but the confrontational father, who was not in a relationship with the girl anymore, had an alibi. Unable to find a convincing perpetrator, the case went unsolved. 6 months later, a young sewage maintenance officer was discovered by a co-worker. There were clear signs of a struggle. He had been grabbed from behind and drowned in the water. Again, he was one of those who had attacked Caden. For a time just prior to my move to London, I attempted to research these murders. Unfortunately, the records for Wickford's local newspaper, the Weekly Echo, only exist from 1968-74, and then from 1995 onwards. The atmosphere that the supposed murders left was toxic, and that was evidence enough for me to want to leave. I did find one article that worked as a kind of evidence. From June 1999 was the report of a 12-year-old girl's disappearance near the River Crouch. The author mentioned in passing that the girl's mother had died in 1986, under similar circumstances to the girl's disappearance. I still wonder today if this means that Caden was also after the children of his original victims. A further 4 of the boys that had played a part in the attack on Caden were gruesomely murdered in the late 1980s. Because I am unsure of these 4 men's names, I will refer to them as B1, B2, B3 and B4. B1's decapitated body was left on the road, and his head just under a sewer grate. B2 was stabbed to death, with the word cold carved into his forehead. B3 and B4 were found sewn together, and had clearly starved to death, stuck in the middle of a sewage pipe, clogging the waste. The girl that had not been killed back in '86 was abducted in March 1991, aged around 27. She was childless, just as all of the other victims had been, bar the first girl. This girl was never murdered. Instead, she was sighted at the high street 3 months after she was taken, with a blank expression. She jumped in front of a car. There was now only one of Jack Caden's attackers left alive. This boy, now a man, became a father in April 1992. I am his son. Allow me to clarify a few details here. I am now 22 years old. I was 19 when I left Wickford. The fact that the first girl's daughter was killed by Caden haunts me to the core. After all, my dad was himself killed and skinned by Jack Caden in 1994. My mother hesitantly told me the story in 2008, after which I went on my researching spree. As I asked around and filled in holes in the story, I likewise talked to people who claimed that my father had died in a car accident, or drowned. I have absolutely no idea why these people would want to actively protect Caden. Maybe they were in denial. One night in 2010, I simply sat down and thought about incidents in my life that I had no explanation for. The more that I looked back through my memories, the more that I believed in the legend of Jack Caden. I noted that when I started at the Bromford Senior School in the Grange area of Wickford, my mother had specifically ordered me to take a longer route than the more convenient London roadway. Obviously, she was worried for my safety that close to Caden's lair. I remembered an afternoon in the summer holidays, when I was around 8 years old. An ugly, bald man that I had assumed to be wearing a very realistic Halloween mask walked up to me as I rode my bike up and down my street. He asked me if I wanted to meet my dad. I told the man that my father was dead, to which he pulled a very sinister expression, strangely visible through the mask, I had thought, and remarked, "I know." I was totally creeped out, and biked home faster than ever before. So why did I abruptly drop everything and make the move in 2011? My mother died of cancer in late 2010. I inherited her house. This heightened my sense of fear day to day. Every time I heard the wind, I jumped. Every time I saw my reflection, my heart skipped a beat. In November 2011, more than 3 decades after Caden's mutilation, I failed to sleep on a stormy night. I kept hearing noises around the house, but whenever I went to investigate, I found no intruder. I was driven so sick by this, that I packed up a small bag, and caught the train to London Liverpool Street Station, to stay with my mother's family there. They had previously offered to host me routinely since my mother's death. I have never gone back to Wickford. Instead, I asked my friends to collect my possessions into a moving van, and I instructed real estate agents to put my house on the market. Like I said before, the reason for my move to London is simple, but holds a very shocking legend. The reason that I moved to London is that the police called me on my first afternoon at my aunt and uncle's house. They informed me that there had been a break-in at my Wickford residence, but that nothing had been taken. Instead, one word had been scrawled on walls all over the house. Cold. Scrawled on walls all over the house. The cold wet cement gritted beneath Layla's black polished dress shoes. Her small countenance crossed the street as her silken green dress flounced along with her. Her black stockings and small gray overcoat had been added to her as the final touch with pride by her teary-eyed mother hours ago. Now remember, Layla, your father and I have saved for years to afford this. You have the opportunity to bring honor to our family, to bring rest amongst our kind, her mother had said. Mrs. Pocket had been smiling with mingled tears of joy and sorrow, as she had finished securing the last black button upon Layla's coat. "But Mama, when will I see you again? Once you have completed the task you are being sent to carry out, then we can unite once more. You are the only one properly qualified for this task amongst us, so make us proud, sweetheart. The creature has been given numerous warnings to remove itself from this land. This entire territory has always belonged to our kind. It is overstepping its boundaries. You need to eliminate it, so do your best and you will succeed." Layla clung desperately to her mother. "But Mama. No. I can't leave you and Father." Her mother had dabbed at her nose with a handkerchief as she sniffled. Mrs. Pocket stooped down to Layla's height and held her hands tightly. "My dear, you must. This is for your own good, and more importantly, for the greater good of our kind. This is a rare opportunity that many could never even dream of having within their grasp. Your whole life will change for the better after this, Layla. You must kill it." Her mother adjusted a bow amongst Layla's mahogany curls and then stood up sharply. "Now, enough of this dreary farewell. The weather looks quite overcast and it's time you be along your way, my love. Write to us." Her mother had blown a kiss to Layla as the stagecoach door had closed firmly behind the girl. After a few hours of traveling throughout the countryside, the footman had finally helped Layla down from the coach. They crossed the street to Miss Terry's school for girls. The finishing school was renowned around all of England. It was extremely expensive, impossible for most to gain admittance, and only a few students were permitted to attend the program at a time. All potential pupils were cross-examined by the mistress of the institute herself for consideration. Only those which Miss Terry deemed suitable and possessing the proper attributes, were even considered for enrollment. And now little Layla would have to take down some gruesome and monstrous creature, perhaps destroying the whole school along with it. The task before her was a daunting one, yet one she had no choice but to undertake. It was here now at Miss Terry's front door that Layla anxiously awaited her new instructor as the footman rang the doorbell. Clouds swirled above them, alluding to heavy rains to come. A bolt from the other side of the door came undone as the door swung open to reveal Miss Terry. She was tall, slender, and clearly gorgeous. Rumors always abounded as to why such a pretty young woman remained unmarried. People supposed that she simply had no time for such frivolities. She had instead chosen to focus entirely on the noble task of improving the future ladies of England. Her delicate nose rested between high cheekbones of blushing pink. Her unblemished pale skin stood out in contrast against her midnight black hair. She had allowed it to flow in a neat braid halfway down her back, its healthy sheen visible in the street lights on that chilled evening. Her mauve lips parted in a gentle smile to reveal dazzling white teeth. She thanked the footman for his services and paid him promptly with a few gold coins. Now all alone on the steps, Layla stood silently with her eyes downcast as she awaited instruction. "So, Miss Layla Pocket," Miss Terry stated flatly. "Yes, ma'am. I am Miss Layla Pocket. Delighted to meet you," said Layla with a polite curtsy. Putting a hand to her hip, Miss Terry intensely stared at Layla with her smoky eyes, eyeballing the girl from head to toe. They stood in an awkward silence for a few seconds longer. The black and red-laced corset on the instructor clasped so tightly to the woman's torso, that it was a wonder to Layla as to how the woman could breathe. Her black skirts swooshed about her as she turned her back to the girl. "The footman will bring your belongings to your room. One of your fellow pupils will show you how your room is to be kept. Tidiness will be observed at all times here at this school. I do not need to mention standards of cleanliness, as you were already briefed upon the subject at our last interview." "Yes, ma'am," replied Layla absent-mindedly as she followed the fast pace of the woman up the staircase. Layla turned over different methods of how to complete her mission in her head. The question "how?" ran through her mind again and again. If you want to become a member of civilized society, you must reassess and alter your appearance immediately. Starting tomorrow, the maids will help you dress each morning and undress each evening. Breakfast is held at 7:30 a.m. in the dining hall with the others. Your classes begin at 8:30 a.m. Just follow the rest of the girls around and you will fall into your schedule along the way. Quite simple to follow, I should say," Miss Terry added curtly. As Layla was led up the large winding staircase, she saw that it opened to a large hallway. Upon taking a right, they were met with another hallway of 10 rooms. 5 rooms to the left faced 5 rooms across the hall to the right. They walked onward and Miss Terry opened the last door to the left at the end of the hall. "These shall be your quarters for the duration of your stay here. I'll see you downstairs for dinner at 6:30 p.m. sharp." The woman's large eyes flitted over Layla one last time as she then turned from the girl and made her way around the corner and out of sight. Layla gasped at the elegance of her new room. A chandelier hung in the center of the room above a large fluffy pink carpet. Golden candelabras sat upon every ivory tabletop. A large 4-poster bed with curtains of pink and lavender rested across a large matching ivory vanity. The vanity was bedecked in an assortment of powders, rouges, pink and red glosses, ribbons, bows, perfumes, and silver brushes. A sofa that matched the candelabras was placed against the wall facing the only window to her room. Potted pink flowers adorned the outside of the window. Layla drew the deep maroon curtains closed. The sight was breathtaking as Layla walked over to run a hand over the cool hard surface of her bedside drawers. It was too bad that she would not get much time to enjoy the peace and quiet of the place. Since Layla still had some extra time left before dinner commenced, she decided to have a look around the rest of the building. She began to wander the hallway outside of her room and found many photos of young girls lining the walls. All of them were solemn-faced as they posed in front of the school. Well, that was rather odd, Layla thought to herself. A photo of Miss Terry was centered at the end of the hall near to Layla's bedroom door. It had to be at least 20 years old from the looks of it. But, not so much as one wrinkle had yet crept onto the woman's face presently. "She's been instructing for at least 30 years now, from what I've heard," said a gentle voice from behind Layla. A blonde-haired girl with large blue eyes stood behind Layla. "I'm Samantha," introduced the girl. "Oh, I'm Layla," she returned politely. "I've been here 1 year now. 4 more left for me before I graduate. Miss Terry tries to make us all like perfect dolls," Samantha indicated to her dress and perfectly brushed hair. "All of these," she pointed to the photos on the walls, "these were her star pupils, her perfect dolls that successfully graduated from her past years of teaching here. I wonder why they all look so sad. Some of them were just small children." "Rather odd," remarked Layla. Samantha went on, "Well, each year Miss Terry selects the top of the class and awards them £50,000 along with a ticket to Paris to further their studies. If they have enough intellect, they graduate early. Typically, all of her students go on to wed rich gentlemen over in France and never return to England. They become such snobs that not even their own families ever hear from them again." "Not even so much as one letter?" questioned Layla. "No, not one, not once they graduate and move on from here," replied Samantha. "How peculiar," thought Layla aloud. "Perhaps we will grow to learn the strange ways of the rich upper class once we become them," ventured Samantha. Layla shrugged. "How many other students are here with us? Right now it is just you, myself, and 2 other girls." Here Samantha stopped speaking abruptly. "Did you hear that?" "What?" Layla asked. "Be quiet, listen," hissed Samantha. As they stood silently in the hall, they could hear heavy footsteps on the staircase. The footsteps thudded against each squeaky step when suddenly the footsteps stopped. Suddenly, children giggling could be heard echoing down the hallway. A small red children's top came spinning from around the corner, and continued to spin in the center of the hallway before them. "Who did that?" Layla asked in a whisper. "The other 2 girls are in their rooms. No one else is here except Miss Terry and the servants preparing dinner downstairs." Samantha's voice trailed off as they continued to watch on. The giggling of little children could still be heard. As Samantha stood fixated in place, Layla walked over to the spinning stop. Stooping down, she watched it spin for a moment, then picked it up and watched the toy continue to spin in her hand. The echoes of laughter stopped as a bell rang. "Oh, that's the dinner bell," explained Samantha. "We must go to our seats at once or Miss Terry will be quite cross with us. Let's go." Layla quickly pocketed the toy and followed her new acquaintance down the stairs. At the dinner table as the first course was served, Miss Terry pointed out that polite dinner conversation was appropriate at this time. "To start, I'll introduce our newest member, Miss Layla Pocket. She will be here with us for the next 5 years. These are Miss Samantha, Miss Carrie, and Miss Abigail," indicated their mistress. "Miss Abigail here has done exceedingly well at this institute. She already celebrated her graduation this Saturday 2 years ahead of schedule." Abigail wore a smug smile as she tossed her long red hair over her shoulder. "Miss Abigail shall be leaving us early tomorrow morning and will go on to travel Europe. I know she will excel at her new school abroad." "Very exciting," finished Miss Terry with a smile as she patted Abigail's hand. "Miss Terry," interjected Layla, "I have a question." "And what would that be?" responded the woman as she smoothed the cheesy spread across a crisp slice of bread. "What other children are here with us in this building?" "What do you mean?" "There were children laughing and playing in the hallway upstairs." "Oh, you are mistaken," she responded coolly, not bothering to look up at Layla as she went on. "Everyone in this house is here at the dinner table before you. And the servants would never be so foolish as to venture upstairs playing children's games." "Well then, who was playing with this upstairs?" questioned Layla as she produced the toy top for all to see at the dining table. At this, the woman stood up violently, knocking her chair to the floor. "Where did you get that?" their instructor snapped. "As I told you, ma'am, I in the hallway upstairs." Flinging herself across the table, their mistress snatched up the object, a glint of wildness in her eyes now. Clasping it close to her bosom, she glared around the dinner table. "There are no other children here at the moment save for you four. No toys are permitted at the table. And filthy lies of phantom children will not be tolerated here at this school. To your room," shouted Miss Terry. At once. Fearfully, Layla made for her room. Once locked inside, she hugged a throw pillow to herself as she sat atop her golden yellow sofa. Candles flickered on her bedside table as the chandelier above twinkled dimly. A hand suddenly wrapped around Layla's ankle from beneath the sofa and began to pull her down to her knees. Layla screamed in utter panic as she tried to undo the grip of the gray hand. A second gnarled hand protruded from beneath the sofa and began to claw at the wooden floorboards, dragging itself forward into the light. "It will get you just like it got us," the creature wheezed. It had the shape of a human but dark wrinkled skin covered it. Its bulbous yellow eyes peered up at Layla as it held on firmly to the girl. As Layla glanced up, she saw dozens of handprints forming on the foggy window. "Run," the creature cried coarsely. Knock. Knock. It was Samantha at the door. "May I come in?" Layla looked about the room, but the creature had vanished altogether along with the handprints. Layla ran to the door and swung it open, breathing heavily. "Oh Layla, come now. It's not that bad here. Like I said, you will get accustomed to life here," Samantha comforted. "No, you don't understand," said Layla. "It's different here, but it is nothing you can't handle," responded Samantha as she squeezed Layla's shoulder supportively. "What about the toy?" questioned Layla. Samantha shrugged. "Maybe the wind blew it into the hallway. Who knows? I just wanted to make sure you are okay. Here, I saved you this cookie." Samantha produced a large chocolate cookie from one of her skirt pockets and set it atop the vanity. "Try to get some sleep. I'll see you in the morning," smiled Samantha as she closed the door behind her. "I've got to figure this out and complete my mission already so I can get out of here," thought Layla aloud. But how? As night fell over the city, Layla waited in her room for all to fall asleep. It was at this point that she planned to make her move. Hurriedly, she donned her gloves, buttoned her jacket, and buckled her shoes into place. At the stroke of midnight, she grabbed a lit candle from her dresser and opened her door slightly to peer through the small crack. A street lamp close by shed a soft white light into the hall. All else was dark and silent throughout the building. This was her chance and she had to take it now. The skeleton key to the building hung on a hook in the front hall. She would use it to quietly search the building unnoticed in the black of night to look for the dreaded creature. As she tiptoed down the dark hall, a certain picture hanging near her caught her eye. Holding the candle to it, Layla could see the photo contained a young girl of about 10 years. The little girl was holding the red spinning toy top in her hand. The girl in the picture blinked. No, it could not be, Layla thought as she stared more intently at the photo. But this time the little girl's eyes widened as she raised a hand and pointed it toward the opening to the hallway. A sudden noise made Layla freeze in place. Each step on the staircase was squeaking one at a time as someone slowly made their way up the darkened stairs. Layla quickly hid herself behind a large drawer ornamented with a large vase of flowers along the wall. Blowing out the candle, she breathed quietly as she watched on. A black figure reached the top of the stairs and turned the corner, slowly entering the hallway of rooms. The dim light just barely lit the image of the figure. She could not make out its face. Without warning, a large pair of black feathered wings spread out from behind it. The eyes were now glowing red. The winged creature looked about as it sniffed the air with a hint of suspicion. Taking a few steps forward, it entered into a room only to re-emerge carrying the sleeping Abigail in its arms. The black wings wrapped around the pair as it slowly made its way down the squeaky staircase. The doors to the front parlor swung open as the fireplace within cast an eerie orange glow across the floorboards in the hall. As the two passed through the open doors, Layla dared to follow them. She slid silently down the banister in the somber house, making sure to gently tiptoe over to peek into the room. Youth, beauty, intellect, and grace, all shall forever be mine as your life's blood I do taste, proclaimed the beast. The winged creature proceeded to plunge a knife into the chest of the sleeping girl and began to devour her heart. Layla's eyes widened in horror when suddenly, a hand from behind her firmly pressed against her mouth. A servant woman still wearing her dirty apron was crouching quietly in the hallway with Layla as the gory scene continued in the parlor. Holding a finger to her lips, the servant indicated for Layla to follow her. They gently tiptoed back up the staircase and past the hallway of rooms. They made their way over to a small door in a corner that led to the servants' quarters up in the attic. Once shut up in a small shanty room the size of a closet, the servant lit a single candle and eyed Layla fearfully. "You will have to leave here at once," declared the woman. "Miss Terry is the abomination that creeps across this school?" Layla exclaimed, thoroughly astounded. "Don't let Miss Terry know you have any idea about what just happened or you will meet the same fate. Tomorrow before breakfast, just get out and run from here." "Why don't you leave too?" questioned Layla incredulously. "Us servants clean up after the blood and bodies. We know too much. If we tried to leave, she would kill us all too. If we stay and do as we're told, then she allows us to live." "What is she? A witch? A demon? Honestly, we have no idea. All we know is she stays youthful and lives forever by eating the hearts of pretty young girls like yourself." "She must be stopped," cried Layla in utter disbelief. "Nothing can stop her," continued the servant. "Not even the souls of the dead here that haunt this place can do anything. This place is a trap. Once you come here, you're trapped." "No," refused Layla point blank. "I reject that. There is no way to stop her. I will find a way." The servant looked at Layla sadly as she could see the girl was determined to stay and fight. "I will find a way," stated Layla with determination as she exited the room. Layla lay awake in her bed with the curtains drawn until the next morning. Hours later, a knock at her door alerted her that it was time to begin her first day of lessons. Two servants entered and dressed Layla tightly into her lavender corset. The pink ribbons matched her rosy pink skirts beautifully. But Layla had only one thing on her mind, and that was to confront the monster that awaited her. Layla could not allow this creature to occupy the land of her kind, not after they had worked so long to live peacefully in the area. Downstairs, Layla flopped unceremoniously into her chair in the dining room and stared unwaveringly at Miss Terry. "Oh! Don't you look like an absolute doll in that?" exclaimed the woman with a smile from across the breakfast table. With a straight face Layla did not acknowledge the woman's compliment and bluntly asked, "Where is Abigail?" The smile Miss Terry wore immediately fell and her eyebrows knitted into a frown. "I mentioned last night, Miss Pocket, that our Abigail had an early morning coach to catch today for her travels abroad." The woman stirred her tea, the spoon chinking lightly against the porcelain cup. "No slouching at the table, Miss Pocket," she snapped. A polite good morning to all at this table would also suffice, young woman. Layla continued to stare at her flatly in silence. "Well, I can see that we shall need to work on your social etiquette, young lady," said the woman with raised eyebrows over her teacup. "I know what you did," Layla stated angrily. The other two girls continued to eat their breakfast awkwardly in the midst of the unpleasant interaction. "Oh really?" Miss Terry asked in a tone of mockery. "And what would that be?" Layla slowly pushed her chair away from the table and stood up. "Funny how your portrait upstairs looks exactly the same as you do now," Layla remarked slyly. "Some age more gracefully than others, I suppose," responded Miss Terry, clasping at the armrests of her chair with wide knuckles. "How old are you exactly?" "I hardly find that to be any of your business," snapped their instructor, now growing visibly angrier by the second. Layla walked around the table to stand near the wall behind the woman. The newest edition of photos, now of Abigail, had been hung proudly on the wall for all to see. "Quite a lovely picture," said Layla as she traced its frame with one finger. "I advise that you recall your manners and seat yourself at once." "Do not touch that," commanded Miss Terry through clenched teeth. "I wonder what would happen if I were to." Layla trailed off as she snatched the photo from the wall and smashed it to the ground. The glass loudly shattered as Miss Terry shrieked, "You stupid girl!" Layla looked down at the broken glass and torn picture to see that a sparkling mist was floating up into the air. A gentle sigh and "thank you" emitted from the mist in Abigail's voice. The mist dissipated. Samantha and Carrie were quickly ushered out of the room to take cover in the cellar by a servant girl. Miss Terry's glossy nails had turned long and black. "Don't do that again," whispered the woman in a very unnaturally deep tone of voice. "Oh, you mean don't do this?" Layla mocked as she hurled another photo smashing to the ground. Again, a sparkling mist accompanied by a young girl's sigh emitted from the wreckage. The woman's hair immediately turned a dull white. Now her eyes glowed neon red. Her black wings spread out from behind her as she stood up menacingly. "You will regret that." "Oh, I think not," Layla responded, sneering at the creature before her. Making a mad dash for the hallway, Layla ran like lightning, knocking down every photo along the way. They all came crashing down amidst shards of glass showers as swirls of trapped souls broke free of their prisons. Miss Terry's teeth had gone yellow and her skin had become a wrinkled shade of gray. "Ugh, you really are an ugly thing, aren't you?" teased Layla as she ran up the stairs and continued to smash photos with glee. Loose hair billowing behind her, the woman swooped through the air with her great wings, landing with a thunderous clash against a china cabinet. "You will die for this girl!" the creature screamed as Layla ran to the end of the hallway of bedrooms. Grabbing the portrait of Miss Terry herself, Layla held it high over her head. "You will never harm another soul again!" shouted the girl. Then with all her might, she smashed the photo into the wall. Glass rained down as the portrait tore and burst into flames. "No!" Miss Terry shrieked as her body was enveloped in a burning blaze of red flames. "No!" Layla stood before her and watched on as the creature finally fell into a heap of smoldering ashes. Wiping a few beads of sweat from her brow with the back of her arm, she made her way back down the stairs. "It's all over!" she shouted. "It's dead now." The servant who had hid Layla in her room the night before emerged from a closet. "Oh dear, look at you. Come, sit. You need a rest." The servant stood alongside Layla and walked her over to take a seat on the sofa in the parlor. "That was so brave of you. I don't know how you did it, but thank you," said the woman in awe. Layla tiredly rested her head on the woman's shoulder as the servant patted her back comfortingly. "And look, not even a scratch on you," remarked the woman bemusedly. At this, Layla opened her mouth in a smile to produce a sharp pair of perfect white fangs. "I know," she retorted as she sank them into the woman's neck. A few drops of blood oozed from the sides of Layla's mouth as she stood to smooth her skirts. Now that's better. The dead body of the servant remained slumped over and lifeless as Layla wiped away traces of blood from her face. "No old magic hell hag is going to take over this territory as long as I am around," remarked Layla to herself as she adjusted the bow in her hair. "Miss Derry, such an amateur," Layla snickered to herself as she made her way into the hallway. "My kind is fully back in control of this land now." With a sigh of relief and feelings of a job well done, Layla went to find the others still hiding in the cellar. "Everybody, it's safe to come out now." Credit to Miss Ivory. "I'm out now." Credit to Miss Ivory. "I'm out now." Credit to Miss Ivory. "I'm out now." Content warning: this pasta contains some gore. He was born with a caul. That was all we knew, and that was all we needed to know. It was a hideous deformity, an extra layer of skin that covered at birth his face at birth and marked him for what he was. I never even learned his name, and I am not sure he had one. He was simply the boy with the caul. In some places it was seen as a sign of good luck. People would say it predestined wealth, or ensured long life. Old cauls were sold to sailors to protect from drowning. They were a blessing, outsiders would say. But we knew better. It was the sign of the devil. It was a sign of a creature so hideous, God himself would cover his face. His eyes would be sharp and mesmerizing, they would draw you in like magnets and hypnotize you. They would peer into your soul to see your secrets and possess you. His speech would be luring and tantalizing, it would demand your attention then bend words to trick and control you. His mind was clever, not with the wisdom of man but with the cunning of a fox, designed to outwit and trap you. 1,000 times people like him had come into the world, and 1,000 times they had used these traits to kill and destroy the lives of innocent people. And for these reasons our God had chosen to hide him from us, and mark him as evil. When he was born they said he should be killed. The pastor demanded it, calling the town to arms to take him into the forest and bury him alive. This, he said, was the only way to ensure he'd be taken back to hell. Many agreed, and surrounded his parents' house. They lit torches and shouted for the child, demanding he be handed over. They chanted and chanted, calling for his blood. They would not allow such a creature into their village, and would kill anyone who tried to get in their way. If need be, they would burn down the house with him inside then bury the ashes. The mother cried and cried, but knew it was what was best. They all did, and accepted that it must happen. The boy had to die. For me the story began on a hot Sunday in August. Church had just ended, and most of the families had gathered for a small festival in the center of the village. The several dozen houses and buildings in the town formed a circle around a large field, separating the forest from where we were standing. The church with its high steeple stood at one end, and the only road in or out was directly opposite of it. Along the road were the farms and lumber mills where the people nearby made their living. The day in question was an annual celebration. Its date wasn't set in stone, it just needed good weather and was always on a Sunday when strawberries would be fresh. Piles and piles of them were brought into the central field and shared among anyone who came by. I was 11 at the time, and was eager to celebrate. I dressed in my best, a brown coat and matching pants, and was led around by my mother's hand. I already had a bag full of the berries attached to my belt, and I ate them slowly with my free hand. The red juice dripping down my face and hands, as we walked through the gathered crowds. I suppose there weren't really that many people there, but to me it seemed like a huge event. I thought anyone who was anyone would be there. However, when I was there I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. By chance I had glanced toward a house at the edge of the village. It was a house I knew well, but had never gone in. It was the only one outside the circle, standing at the very edge of the forest and half consumed by it. Many times at night I had heard cries and moans coming from it, sounds that every child heard but every adult seemed to deny existed. I had never seen anyone enter or leave it in the 11 years I was alive. Today was different. I looked at the highest window of the house. It was shuttered, but a crack in the shutter let me see into it. There I saw a face I had never seen before. It seemed to be the same age as me, with a thin face but thick, dark brown hair. It stared wistfully toward the celebration, a look of sadness and desire that comes from seeing something you desperately want but will never have. I tugged on my mother's hand. She was a pretty woman, with light brown hair, blue eyes and a face that was used to smiling. "Mama," I asked, "who is that boy?" She looked at me with a smile. "Who do you mean, John?" "The young boy in that window over there." I pointed towards the window I had seen him. A look of dread came into my mother's eyes, and she went pale. That was no one. Don't ask about it. But there was someone there. See. I looked back, but the window was empty. Well, there was someone. Well, even if there is, he's gone. Forget about it. But I was sure No, she said sternly. No more of this. I don't want to hear any more. By the end she was almost shouting, and people had turned to look. Embarrassed, she took me by the hand and led me back to our house. I protested, wanting to get back to the party and not understanding what I had done wrong, but she dragged me into my room. My father was right behind her. He was perhaps the largest man in the village, and was broad-shouldered and muscular. His look of anger was enough to terrify anyone, especially me. He grabbed me by the shoulder and pointed a finger at my face. "Look, boy," he said, "you better forget what you think you saw. Whether there was something there or not, there was no person there. Get it out of your head." He left and shut the door behind himself. But I couldn't get the face out of my mind. It was burned into it, etched into my thoughts. Every time I closed my eyes I saw his. My parents both told me there was nothing there, and ordered me to stay away. Sometimes I wish I had listened, or even could have listened. But I knew I had seen something. I needed to know what it was. I was willing to do anything to see it. That night I paced back and forth in my room. I had tried to sleep, but couldn't get it out of my mind. The thought was possessing me, luring me toward the window and a boy who may or may not have been inside. I made up my mind. Though I consciously decided against it, my unconscious mind that demanded I go, and after hours of fighting it I relented. I opened the door to my room and stuck my head out, listening. I didn't hear any movement, and assumed my parents were both asleep. I snuck out of the room, down the stairs and out the front door. Once I was out I was running. It was dangerous to be out at night, especially near the forest. Wild animals filled it and could attack you at any moment, tear you to pieces and consume you before anyone could come to help. There were even rumors of things worse than animals, things that God could not look at, and we all knew to stay away. However, tonight I had to go through. I ran outside the circle of houses and towards the edge of the forest. My heart raced faster and faster as I ran, warning me of the danger I could be in. The shadows of the trees blocked the moonlight, leaving me in near pitch darkness. The branches reached towards me like claws, waiting for any slip or trip to grab a hold of me and pull me inside. Every sound and movement seemed like a creature waiting for a chance to pounce on me. I ran, and finally reached the house. I looked up at it. There, at the top of the house, was the shuttered window. I knew I needed to find a way inside. I looked around me. One of the branches of the nearest tree came very close to the window. I ran to the trunk and climbed it. I climbed along the branch and peered through the crack of the shutter. Inside it was pitch black. I tried the latch on the window. The metal on the latch was bent into place and wouldn't budge, and the hinges were worn and rusted. I climbed down the tree again, grabbed a rock, and climbed back up. Everything I knew warned against it. I had seen the fear in my mother's face, and the anger in my father's at the suggestion I may come here. Even the room itself seemed to scream danger. The darkness inside could conceal anything, and I wasn't sure I wanted to see what it hid. My parents insisted I hadn't seen another human, and I didn't want to know what that implied. However, I had seen something, and had to know what it truly was. I rammed the stone against the latch, bending it slightly back to how it should be. I rammed it again and again, until it was straight and I could open it. I did so, and yanked at the shutters, only to find they were tied with rope as well. I tore at the string, breaking it piece by piece until it fell down toward the ground. I paused a moment. It was clear that someone didn't want the shutters open. They must truly have feared whatever was inside. I sat in the tree, shaking with fear for what seemed like an eternity. Every ounce of reason I had warned me against what I was doing, but the desire to see was overwhelming. While my dread pushed me away, the face in my curiosity of it drew me in. I looked back through the forest. The idea of going back was almost as terrifying as going forward. In the end, I simply couldn't resist it. I pulled at the shutters, causing them to squeak and moan. I looked in. The blackness inside was impenetrable. The only illumination was a small square of moonlight which came from the window, partially blocked by my own head. The rest of the room was impossible to see. With a gulp of fear, I stepped in. Instantly I regretted the decision. I stumbled and fell as I stepped, my face landing on wooden floorboards covered in dust. The panic inside me rose dramatically, and I tried to gain my feet but tripped over an unseen object in the darkness. I hit my head against a wall, and remained on the floor for a moment, dizzy. I became aware of another being inside the room. I could not see it, and had no idea what it was. At first there was only the indescribable sense of something being there, and the knowledge that it was watching me. Though I couldn't identify it, I feared it, and everything inside me told it was dangerous. I didn't know what, but there was something wrong with it. I heard footsteps, light ones which were difficult to hear and impossible to place. My breath caught, and I looked around in the darkness, trying to find out where the footsteps were coming from. However, there was no sign of who, or what, made them. I was left immobile from fear. "You shouldn't have come here," a voice said. It was deep and low, with a hard edge that conveyed hate despite being little more than a whisper. Instantly I scrambled toward the window of light. However, I heard the telltale creak of the rusted shutters. As I reached toward it in vain, the light was cut off from me, and I heard the latch go into place. I was left in complete darkness. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for something to save me. I begged for forgiveness for my sins, and desperately wished it was a dream. However, I knew nothing would come to save me from my mistakes. A light flashed in front of me. For a second it was blinding, and my eyes stung from trying to look at it. Slowly it settled into the light of a single candle. The light focused on the outline of a body holding a club, raised high in the air above me. The face was the one I had seen earlier, and it snarled at me. I cowered, holding my hands up and looking away. "Please don't hurt me," I said. "I only came to see who you were." "Liar," he said. "This is another trick. What were you planning to do while I slept? What would have happened if I didn't get you first?" "Nothing. I swear." "No. You're a thief and a murderer. You were here for me, but I'll get you first." He kicked at my stomach, and I groaned from the impact. "No, please. I swear I'm not. I'm a friend," I cried desperately. I lay still, waiting for the club to come down. I briefly wondered if I would even feel it, or if it would crack my skull on the first blow. I whimpered, wishing I hadn't come. But the club never came. I looked up to see him still standing above me holding the club, but he looked confused. "Friend?" he asked. "Why?" I don't know. I just saw you earlier and wondered who you were," I replied. He lowered the club slightly, but still held onto it. As my eyes grew accustomed to the light, I saw that it was really the broken leg of a chair. The object I had tripped over was the edge of a cot which was on the floor. "How do I know this isn't some kind of trick?" he asked. "Why would I trick you?" I had suddenly remembered the bag of strawberries that was still at my belt. I took one out and handed it to him. "Here. Have a strawberry," I said. He reached for it and looked at it curiously. Suddenly he snarled again. "Liar. This is a trick again." He threw the strawberry at me, and raised the club. "No. I swear. Here, look." I took one out of the bag and began eating it, then handed him another. He looked at it for a moment, then took a tentative bite. His eyes went wide, and he said it's good. I nodded, and he kept eating. For a moment I saw the same look of sad wishfulness I had seen earlier, of longing for something beyond his reach. We were interrupted by the opening of the door. A gray-haired and old but still hard-looking man stood in the doorway. He glared at us and pointed his finger toward the boy. "You. What are you doing?" He started to walk towards us. The other boy, clearly frightened, threw away the club and the strawberry and tried to stammer a response. I don't not know. He just came in. I don't know who he is." The man ignored his words and picked him up roughly by the shoulder. "You stay right here. We are going to have some words with your little visitor." With that, he grabbed me by the shoulder and pulled me out the door. I tried to protest, but stopped when I saw my father standing behind him. My father took me to another room as the man walked back into the boys'. I heard more of the moans and cries I had heard before. He returned a minute later. "What's going on?" "I just wanted to talk to him," I said. "That's not the sort of boy you should be talking to," he said, sounding as much genuinely concerned as angry. I looked around the room. The old and frail pastor was there, as was my mother and a blonde woman I had seen before but didn't know. "Who is he?" I asked. He's my son," the gray-haired man said, sounding guilty. "Yes, he is. He is my baby boy and yours too," the blonde woman said, on the verge of tears. "And you should remember it. He doesn't deserve this." "I do remember it. God, I think about it every day. But there is nothing I can do about it, is there?" the man replied in a hurt voice. Now, calm down," the pastor said. "There is no need to be upset, or to blame yourself. It could have happened to anyone, and you have done your best." He put a hand on the man's shoulder, calming him. "And ma'am, you know it is for the best in the end. It may be hard, but you have to be strong." He repeated the gesture on the woman's shoulder, and it seemed to have the same effect. "Now, we have another problem. Little Johnny here decided to meet the other boy, and caused a bit of mischief." "Yes, and after I distinctly told him not to," my father said angrily. "Didn't you know how dangerous that was? You're lucky you didn't get hurt." The gray-haired man reacted as if he was visibly struck at the mention of my being hurt. "You could have been, and it just isn't right that you would be. I've done everything I can to make sure nothing would." The pastor interrupted him. "All right, it's fine. We know you work hard to avoid this scenario, and nothing bad came of it." I was getting more and less patient. "All right, I won't do it again, but who is he?" They all looked at me, then exchanged glances. Then the pastor spoke. "When he was born, he had a caul. That is an extra flap of skin that covers the face like a mask. Do you know what that means?" "Yes, I do," I replied in quiet voice. I had heard the stories of what people who were born with cowls could do. "What happened?" The pastor continued. "Well, after he was born, the families had gathered to destroy him. It wasn't something they wanted to do, but they knew it had to be done. However, they were stopped. The child's mother, a woman named Margaret, pleaded with her husband Tom to spare him. She knew of the legends, but could not bear to part with her son. She claimed they could keep him apart from others to contain his demented nature. She pleaded and pleaded. And he relented. Though he knew it would have been for the greater good, he was convinced by his wife. He gave in, and told the pastor and gathered crowd of his decision. They agreed, on one condition. The parents must watch and control his every move. They could not forget, even for a second, what he truly was. Even acts of kindness and sweetness may only be to deceive them, and he should be met with coldness and harsh discipline. Only in this way could they ensure his true side doesn't break out. If they fail, they would be to blame for what happens. They agreed, and the child was allowed to live. However, his life wouldn't be much like any other. It was fairly clear why I had never seen him before. He was kept apart from other children, both because of his own parents hiding him and other parents not wanting their children near him. He was never allowed to attend school, There is no telling what he would do with knowledge anyway. He was banned from church and didn't attend any village celebrations. When it came to work, he always worked alone. He wasn't trusted with an axe for wood or a rifle for hunting, but he could carry heavy objects or smash boulders with a large double-handed hammer when digging fields or basements. Other children were either told to avoid him or never saw him at all. When they did see him, they never allowed him to join their games, and would either ignore him completely or taunt him until he left. Most of his life was spent in the top floor of the house he lived in. The windows were always shut and locked, and the door to his room could be locked from the outside. When he was allowed out, he was constantly watched by his father, and others generally avoided him. It was by mutual consent his family moved to the outskirts of town. The parents rarely came out, as they knew they would be blamed for anything that happened if they didn't watch him. Margaret became constantly depressed, wanting to comfort her son but knowing she couldn't, and Tom seemed to blame himself, so they didn't want to leave much anyway. Discipline for him was always harsh. His parents knew that anything he said may be a trick, and behind his every action was ill will. His father kept a stick near his door at all times to use if he got too out of hand. The pastor was another main influence on his life. Though he took no pleasure in causing the boy harm, he saw it as his duty to keep his evil away from others. He often took part in his discipline, or came to pray over him. After the first encounter, my father too began to see him more. He would volunteer to watch him while he worked, and would get angry at any sign of disobedience. Like the boy's father, he carried a stick when he was near him, but it was much thicker. When I questioned him about it, he only explained that he would do what needed to be done to protect his family, and he thought he could do it by controlling the boy. I saw him a few times after that year. I watched him on occasion, and always from a distance. Over the years he became muscular and strong, used to hard work and not much else. Every time I saw him I would pay attention to his face. We were warned against it, and most people avoided looking right at him, as he may try to control or deceive you. However, I needed to see his expression. People would pass by him, glancing with nervousness or anger at him. Conversations would stop within his earshot. Every time this happened he would look hurt for a moment, then his pain would become anger, and he would glare back at them. This would confirm for whoever passed that they were right to hate him, and they would continue on. Over time I saw his looks of anger get worse and worse, harder and harder. The hurt looks all but disappeared, and were replaced with a constant glare that he turned on anyone and everything that he saw. I saw more hate in his eyes than I had seen in every other person I ever met. By the time I was 15, I was sure there was nothing else inside of him. It was that summer when I was 15 that the worst part came. It was the anniversary of when I had first seen him, and once again we were having the celebration with strawberries. At first the party was going well, just like any other year. The sun was warm, and people were happy. However, I began to sense a strange feeling of unease among the people there. I saw more and more upset faces, and people glancing around each other nervously. It took me a while to find the source of the discomfort. Walking among the crowd was a stranger. Despite the heat, he wore a long coat and had its collar turned up and a hat with a wide brim that he turned down over his eyes. The result was that it was impossible to make out his face. People watched him suspiciously, muttering to themselves. He walked around without speaking or looking directly at anyone there. Eventually it became clear he realized people were nervous about him. His stride became awkward and unconfident, his shoulders slumped, and he kept his head down. This only made people more nervous, and a wide circle formed around him. Finally, a black-haired man I recognized as a farmer named Rick approached him. "Excuse me, but who in the hell are you?" Rick asked. The stranger stopped walking and began shaking, but didn't respond. I said, "Who are you? And why the hell are you wearing the get-up?" Rick asked again, more angrily. The stranger still didn't respond, and began to back away slowly. "Answer me!" Rick shouted, and grabbed the stranger's hat. There was a gasp in the crowd as his face became clear. It was the boy, and most of the crowd recognized him. They began murmuring and backing away from him. "You!" a loud, angry voice said. It was my father, and he was approaching quickly. "What the hell are you doing here?" I just wanted. The boy's explanation was interrupted by a loud smack as my father's fist slammed into his jaw. The crowd gasped, and the boy fell down. "I just wanted to try the strawberries. I swear I meant no harm." "Oh yeah? Then what was with that disguise? What were you trying to hide, boy?" He had no answer, and fumbled around with his words. I don't care what lies you have to say. Get out now," my father shouted and pointed away from the celebration. The crowd began to shout their agreement. "But I just wanted," the boy began, but was constantly interrupted by the shouts and jeers from the crowd. As one, the people of the village condemned him and demanded he leave. Once again, his had a pained expression, but it quickly turned to one of anger. He stood up and pointed at the audience, his eyes cold with hate and a snarl on his face. You bastards," he shouted, "every last one of you. I've done nothing to any of you, and yet you condemn me every day. Don't give us that. We've all seen you glaring at everyone as if you're going to kill us. Why do you think we don't want you here?" a voice said, and most of the crowd shouted in agreement. "You liars. It was all from you. I don't just hate you all, I despise you with the depths of my heart. And how you deserve it. I will show you all. And especially you." He swept his finger around the crowd, then settled on my own father. He turned away and walked through the crowd which opened up in front of him. He began running, and was pelted with bad berries until he was away from the celebration. Soon he was back at the house near the forest. His parents and the pastor followed close behind him. The celebration ended soon after. Everyone had a sour taste in their mouths from the events, and didn't feel like celebrating. It ended early, and everyone went home for the night. Later that night I was sitting at the wooden dinner table in my home. The room I was in served as our kitchen, dining room, and living room all at once. However, it was simple, with furniture consisting of a stove, the table, and a few chairs, along with a few shelves on the walls and plain wooden flooring. The front door was at one end, a staircase leading to the bedrooms was at the other, and a few pair of windows were on the other two side walls. I was attempting to read by candlelight, and my mother was sewing. My father was out at a meeting with other members of the village. Suddenly he burst in the front door, and closed it quickly behind him and locked it. I could tell by the speed with which he moved and the rare fear in his eyes that something was wrong. "All right, listen up you two," he said. "We've got to lock up the doors and windows." "What's wrong?" my mother asked. "That call boy is gone." "What? Where?" she said. She ran to each window, closed the inner shutter, and locked them. "We don't know. The pastor and his parents locked him in his room after he went down to the celebration. However, when his father checked tonight, he wasn't there. We don't know where he went, or what he is up to. The advice for now is to lock all doors and windows. Don't leave for any circumstances. He may play tricks to get people out of their homes." "But what if he comes here?" I asked. "If we lock the doors he won't be able to do anything. Anyway, I have my rifle." He pointed to the corner of the room where it was kept. We sat for a moment in silence, looking at each other. A nervous pit formed in my stomach, making me feel almost nauseous. That boy was out there somewhere, and we didn't know where. I kept thinking back to the celebration. He had threatened everyone, and pointed around the crowd. However, in the end it was my father he had settled on. I knew he had more hate for my father than for anyone else in town. I could see it in his eyes. All those years my father had been the roughest on him, believing it would protect his family. Now it may have condemned us. Time passed slowly as we waited for what we all half knew was coming. Then I heard a click at the door. Not a knock, a click, like something metallic. We glanced at each other again, wondering what it might have been. Finally I stood up and walked toward the door, put my hand on the handle, and pushed. "Wait. Don't open it. It may be a trap," my mother said, panicking. Not that it mattered if I did anyway. It took me a second to realize what it was exactly I was feeling. The nervousness I felt in my stomach was replaced with fear, then outright terror. The door had been locked from the outside. I turned back toward my family, eyes wide and mouth hanging open. I saw my expression matched within their faces as they realized what had happened. "Help, help, help!" I screamed, but suddenly realized no one would be coming. We had all been told not to leave for anything, and that he may try to trick us out of our own homes. Any call for help, unless there was an obvious danger, would just be treated as a trick. Even if they were almost sure it was real, no one would want to risk it with him out there. We heard footsteps running around the house. A dark shadow passed by one of the windows, and the footsteps came behind the building. We heard scratching at the back of the house, behind the stairwell. We backed away from it, not knowing what it was he was doing, and not wanting to find out. Soon his actions became clear. Smoke began to drift into the room, and a fire began to build until the back wall was in flame. "Get out!" my father screamed, and tried to push against the door. He rammed his full body against it, but it wouldn't budge. From the small bit we could see through the crack on the side, he had rammed a steel bar against it and wedged it in place. We glanced around in panic. The windows were glass, but that could be broken. My father opened the shutters, grabbed a chair and threw it through one of the windows. He helped my mother through, then myself. I turned around to help him from the outside. However, he wasn't coming. I looked in and saw him staring toward the corner of the room where the rifle was. The entire area was covered with flame, and the rifle was invisible behind it. "Don't do it, Dad," I said. "You can't." "I know," he said, "but I need to." "No. Come on," I shouted back. The room was completely full of smoke, and it burned me to even be close to the house. The roof was creaking and could collapse at any moment. He relented, and began climbing out the window. I helped him through, and began pulling. However, he was much larger than either of us, and struggled to fit. As he came out, his leg ran along a sharp blade of glass, cutting a long gouge on his calf and ankle. He screamed, and collapsed to the ground. "Go. Run to the sheriff's house and get help," he said. My mother and I looked at each other. "Go," he shouted. I began to lift him up by the arm. "Run and get someone, I will help him," I said to my mother. She nodded, and began to run. Despite his protests, I balanced his weight across my shoulders. He stumbled beside me, leaning for support whenever he used the injured leg. We moved as quickly as we could. The darkness of the night was even starker when compared with the fire we were just in, and our eyes couldn't adjust. Everywhere we heard more screaming and shouts for help, and people ran about us in panic. At least 3 other buildings that I could see were burning, one of them the church. We walked into the center field of the field, heading toward the sheriff's home which stood across from ours. It occurred to me he likely wasn't even there anymore, as he would be the only one to respond to the cries for help, but my mother had run in that direction and I had nowhere else to go. I strode on, pulling half the weight of my father along with me. "Going somewhere?" a voice asked. I turned to see who had spoken, and screamed as loud as I could. I was instantly filled with terror. There, outlined by the moonlight, was the boy with the call. He stood up straight and held his hammer in his hands. He raised it up into the air and came towards us. We both began running away. Forgetting all plans of seeing the sheriff, we ran and stumbled randomly into the darkness, calling for help from anyone who could give it. I turned back again and again to see him chasing us, each time getting closer and closer. The tip of his hammer seemed to be within inches of my head, and he had it raised, ready to swing the instant he could. Every door we passed was locked, and every cry for help we raised went unanswered. I kept calling, though I knew anyone who would be willing to leave the safety of their homes would already be fighting the fires. I was losing my breath from helping my father, and couldn't run anymore. Where are you going? No one is going to help you. You are all mine," he screamed. Finally we came near a house, and found the door to be unlocked. I pushed inside and stumbled into a living room much like our own. We both slammed the door shut then locked it. Not satisfied with simply locking it, we leaned against it and pressed to keep it shut. We looked around. There was no one in the room. It occurred to me that the family who lived here must have been one of the few to respond to a fire or a call for help and had left the door unlocked. Suddenly I heard a loud banging noise and felt the entire door shudder. The noise came again, this time accompanied with a crack as some of the wood began to break. It was him, smashing the door with his hammer. "I know you're in there," he shouted, almost tauntingly. He slammed the door again, and it cracked more and more. "I'm coming to get you. This won't protect you for long." Each swing of the hammer brought the door closer to breaking. I could feel the swing of the hammer get harder and harder as there was less between me and the assailant. Finally the door gave way with a massive crack and burst into splinters. I was thrown back from the force and landed hard against the ground. My father held himself against the table and tried to charge him, but the boy swung his hammer hard against my father's knee, splintering it like the door. I tried to get up and grab him. He saw me coming and jabbed the hammer into my gut, winding me and forcing me down. He grabbed a cabinet and pulled it down on me, pinning me to the ground. As I lay on the ground trying desperately to breathe, I saw him stand over my father, his eyes filled with hate. "Oh, how long I've waited," he said, "how long I've waited for this day." He kicked at my father, who moaned helplessly at him and grasped his useless knee. "All those years you treated me like I was nothing. Well, look at us now. Now look who really is nothing." He began kicking my father in the gut. "You will pay for what you did to me," he said, still kicking. He grabbed the unbroken leg, and pulled it straight. My father tried to kick him off, but was too injured to fight and overpowered. The boy took a rope and tied his foot down to a floorboard he loosened with the hammer, then repeated the process with each of his arms. This left him with one leg broken and the other three outstretched. He raised the hammer up and brought it down on the outstretched knee. My father screamed in pain. It was an almost unnatural sound, coming from a pain beyond anything I had ever experienced. "You wanted to fear me? I will give you a reason to fear me," the boy said. He raised the hammer again and swung it at my father's arm. There was a loud crack, and the bone jutted out from his skin. I watched in terror as my father's screams turned into a horrid gurgling noise unlike any I had ever heard a human make. "I want you to feel as I always felt. Helpless, useless, with nothing you can do to ease the pain." The boy raised the hammer again and smashed my father's second arm. He didn't even scream this time, he only convulsed and made the same inhuman gurgling noise. "And now, I am going to kill you. I will kill you for all you ever did to me." The anger in the boy's voice had peaked, and he stepped toward my father's head. I tried to call out to him and beg him to stop, but I could barely breathe and he ignored everything I did. He stood over my father for a moment, the anger in his face became a twisted, triumphant smile. He raised the hammer again. I saw my father's eyes open, staring at the end of the hammer with fear. But there was nothing he could do. His body was ruined and he had no defense against the onslaught. He turned his head away. The boy shouted and swung as hard as he could into the side of my father's head. It smashed into it with a terrible gushing noise. The hammer went completely through his skull and slammed into the floor beneath. Blood splattered around the floor, along with bits of his face skull. When he lifted it again, there was nothing left recognizable as a head. The boy snarled, and swung the hammer again and again into the body, causing it to break and burst. I was beyond tears, and tried to call for him to stop. Finally he looked over at me. The same twisted smile was on his face, mixed with an unending well of hate. He came toward me, lifting the hammer up. I tried to speak to him, beg him to stop, but I couldn't raise my voice. He stood over me, looking down at my face. He kicked me in the chest, and I grunted. "I don't know who you are," he said, "but you were one of them. All those years you rejected me, hated me, abused me. You deserve to die like the rest." He raised the hammer again, and I cowered beneath him, holding my hands up and looking away. The hammer didn't come down. I looked back up at him to see him standing in shock. It's you," he said. From that one night, for the third time, he had the look of sad wishfulness, a desire for something and a knowledge he could never have it. He dropped the hammer, and backed away slowly. Finally he ran out the door. I was found the next day by the owner of the house I was in and helped up. It was then I found out the extent of what had happened. In totally he had burned down 4 buildings. Aside from our house it was his own, the pastor's, and the church. It seemed he was targeting people who had affected him the most. Along with my father, the pastor had been killed in the fire, and he had killed one other man who had tried to stop him. His parents, however, had managed to escape unharmed except for a few burn marks. However, that wouldn't last long. The boy with the call was soon found hiding in the forest. He was grabbed, tied up, and dragged back to the town to be charged. Along with him went his parents. They had argued for his life and refused to kill him, and were trusted to keep him in check. When they failed, they were guilty. They brought the evil into the world and failed to contain it. I wanted no part of the events that followed, but they were almost unavoidable. The crowds gathered again in the center of the village, but this time for a much more sinister purpose. The parents, for the crime of bringing evil into the world and not controlling it, were sentenced to be burned at the stake. That way, their souls could be cleansed. They screamed and begged as they were dragged out and hoisted onto the poles of wood, but they were ignored. Sticks were piled around them, and a torch was brought. Margaret screamed and wept in fright. Tom only stared with an empty look in his face, knowing full well what he had brought into the world. Even from where I was, far away and sitting in another house, I could smell the flesh burn and hear the screams. The smell of smoke remained for days, and the sound of their screams never left my mind. The boy, however, could not be redeemed even with fire. He was evil from birth, and nothing could save his soul. Instead, he was to be returned to the hell he came from. The method of doing this was clear. He was tied up and wrapped in thick, white cloth. A hole was dug, far deeper than any grave the village had dug before. They lowered him in, careful to ensure he didn't die from the fall and lived through his full punishment. They began to shovel dirt on him and buried him alive. He shouted and swore, cursing those around him with his last breaths, and screamed in terror the entire time. However, he didn't beg for mercy, as he knew there was no one there who would give him any. And that was the end of the boy with the cow. Many times, people asked why it happened, and how anyone could commit such horrendous acts. The people from the village always give the same answer. He was born with a caul. That is all we knew, and all, or so they'd tell you, we needed to know. Credit to Eric AMBM. Credit to Eric AMBM. Credit to Eric AMBM. Credit to Eric AMBM. Credit to Eric AMBM.